All right, hi everyone. Welcome to our third panel for the day. Orkun from Sichia just presented a talk on why Bitcoin needs zk. For this panel, we'll be diving into a bit more about the how with zkVM specifically. We're very excited to have our panelists join here today. We have Ming from zkM, Morgan from Lita, Jacob from RISC0, and Ratan from Succinct. To discuss the roles about zkVMs specifically in Bitcoin scaling. So just as some context, we'll examine how zkVMs can be integrated into Bitcoin scaling approaches. All of our panelists will discuss their respective zkVM implementations, any kinds of technical and architectural design considerations for integrating zkVMs with BitVM and other L2 designs, and also the security implications for the network. So our goal here is to flesh out the different opportunities and then also potential limitations and trade-offs, and really try to analyze where zkVMs fit into enhancing Bitcoin scalability. Each of our panelists here are major contributors to the top zkVMs and have been in the zk space for many years now and have many insights to share. So I'm very excited to have this discussion with all of you. But to start, I'm wondering if each of you can introduce yourself, the project you're working on, and highlight any kind of research, integrations, or examples tied to your zkVMs that are being used for Bitcoin scaling. So Ratan, how about we start off with you? Yeah, Ratan, sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, no worries. Yeah, maybe try rejoining and coming back. Okay. Next on my screen, I see Jacob. How about you start while we wait for Ratan?
Yeah, so my name's Jacob. I'm the product lead for the protocol that Viscera is building, which is called Boundless, which the main goal of the protocol is to make zk more accessible. We invented this really nice RISC-V zkVM that a bunch of really smart people are working on as well. And that really changed the notion of doing zk as, instead of having a PhD in cryptography, just writing Rust. However, just writing Rust and generating zkPs does not get you to a production-ready application. So we're building Boundless to abstract that away. And of course, Bitcoin's a big focus there. A few teams we're working with, Citrea, which is building a Bitcoin L2, Bitcoin OS, which has a verifier, Layer Edge, which is a Bitcoin aggregator, and we're also working with the really good folks at Babylon and Fiamma.
Great.
Awesome. Should I hop in now, Alice? Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
All
can
good?
hear you perfectly.
Great. Yeah, no, it is. Thanks for the intro, Alice. I missed a bit of what Jacob was saying, but it's good to see all of you here. Yeah, I can give a brief intro on what we're working on here at Succinct, and then talk a little bit more about the projects that are building on top of us in Bitcoin. So at Succinct, we're building SP1, which is one of the leading zkVMs. We work pretty closely with a lot of teams to really help them take applications that depend either on scalability or privacy, and leverage zk to make those applications actually possible, right? So we most recently been working pretty closely with teams in the Ethereum rollup ecosystem, where we've seen that previous approaches to zk have been quite difficult to deploy. So you had to make trade-offs of, oh, I need to have a team of cryptographers that are working on the zero-knowledge circuit for my rollup, and the iteration timeline on actually deploying that would be on the order of years. Now, teams can take production-ready libraries like Reth, which are written in Rust, compile that into RISC-V, and run it with SP1 to actually get production-ready security and performance with zk, which is, I think, quite powerful. I think with Bitcoin, what we're seeing is the early innings of such deployments, right? So at Succinct, we've already taken one such rollup and actually deployed it into production with OP Succinct, which is using the OP stack to essentially proving the OP stack instead of zk. And with Bitcoin, I think we're excited to see how not only bridges, but actually proofs of Bitcoin can be used to unlock new applications, right? So people want to bridge assets from Bitcoin to Ethereum and other ecosystems more trustlessly. We work with a team called Rift, which actually has implemented that. They bridge state from Bitcoin to L2s and the ETH L1 to actually enable such a bridge. We're also working with teams like Nubit. I did a chat with them recently, and they're building this project called Goldnulls, which essentially takes ordinals, but actually removes the trusted off-chain indexer component and makes it fully trustless with zk. So yeah, there's a couple of cool projects I think we're pretty excited about. They're in the Bitcoin ecosystem related to bridging, making applications more trustless, and then also unlocking better scalability via rollups or other mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you, Ratan. Morgan, would you like to go next?
Hi, Morgan Thomas. I'm a cryptography engineer at Lita. We're building the Valida toolchain and zkVM. So this is a zero-knowledge virtual machine based on the Valida ISA, which is an instruction set architecture designed specifically for use in zkVMs. We also build the associated compiler toolchain, which can compile C code and Rust code to run on the Valida zkVM. Our main focuses are sort of performance, speed and efficiency of proving, as well as space efficiency, and usability, time to market for projects building on the system, as well as security. We don't have any major applications yet. We're still working on getting everything to a level of maturity where production-ready applications can be built on our stack. I am aware of some R&D that's going on that could be used to connect Valida with Bitcoin, and I'm happy to talk more about that later.
Thank you, Morgan. Ming, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. So my name is Ming Guo. I'm the co-founder, chief scientist of zkVM. We also developed a zkVM called zkMIPS. Yeah, it's based off the old and very stable MIPS architecture. So MIPS is actually very similar to RISC. We can call ourselves RISC serial for that matter. So for us in zkM, we already take action to support zkVM and any kind of computation on Bitcoin. So we spin off a project which is sponsor of this conference, Goat Network. So we kind of envisioned a era of more application on blockchains. Bitcoin is famous for the fact that it's used as a store of value instead of the initial Satoshi's, in his white paper that for Bitcoin to be a P2P payment system. So why use Bitcoin as a computing platform? It's probably not going to be very good, even if we make it good with BitVM and zkVM, it's still not going to be very good. But there's a need for a lot of value holders on Bitcoin to generate yield, which is why Goat Network is built itself around. For that matter, zkMIPS provides a foundation to support Goat Network's ambition to be the value generator, dividend generator for Bitcoin holders. Let's just start from there.
Thank you for all of your intros. I wanted to first start off with a bit of a discussion about some of the strides that are being made into making Bitcoin more programmable. Like what you mentioned, Ming, we have BitVM. There's some potential for new opcodes such as opcat to be implemented. There's some new strides being made with the development of covenants and many other sort of developments. But what kinds of frameworks, tools, or cryptographic mechanisms do you believe are needed to make Bitcoin scaling with zkVMs more feasible? Are there any kind of trade-offs to consider when using these kinds of tools? How about we first start off with Jacob?
Yeah, I think Bitcoin, alongside other ecosystems, are in a really, really nice spot right now. Ethereum has spent multiple billions, maybe even 5 billion on ZK research over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And we're all sort of converging on this standard of a zkVM, which of course we're all working on right now. And it will just be a huge unlock. I mean, Ratan already touched on this a little bit, but you no longer need to raise $100 million and have a team of 15 cryptographers to build ZK applications. And now you have to do write in Rust. I think there are quite a few different bridge designs out there right now. You have Opcat, you have BitVM too, and I know there's some other standards that are floating around that all come with a different set of trade-offs. But regardless, the Bitcoin community does not need to worry about a large R&D effort implementing them all in ZK. Once they converge onto that standard, they should be able to do it quite easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And really like the focus that we no longer need to have these advanced cryptographers or mathematicians or just anyone who has an intensive background in ZK to be able to write these ZK applications. And I think a lot of zkVM projects here are really kind of advocating for that kind of vision. Does anyone else have any thoughts as to the types of tools, new opportunities that can be provided, as well as their potential trade-offs?
Yeah, let me jump in. So it's actually quite a challenge to build apps for Bitcoin. The reason is that the design of Bitcoin from its founder Satoshi Nakamoto, he actually actively kind of raised the security concern to reduce the compute power of Bitcoin. So that poses a big challenge, which is the host that you're developing for doesn't want more compute. I think that's a bad thing. So that's why we had the awkward situation that all the excellent talks before about the Opcat route and BitVM. The zkVM's role in this is that we kind of enabled arbitrary computation. This kind of verified computing can be readily verified on Bitcoin, although not very conveniently. And the challenges is actually not on the zkVM side, I think. It's still on the Bitcoin side, how to implement either path, right? Either pathways. Opcat, which is probably mostly a political debate rather than a technology one. They could just because Opcat was originally there, and Satoshi took them out very early on, and they could, the community can just vote on to enable it. For BitVM, that's of course a lot of development was going on, including us. I think the ultimate deciding factor is any application is the UX. Whoever has the most convenient UX, the experience, to sort of align with the purpose of zkVM is that you take cryptography, you take like needing 50 PhDs, taking them out of the factor of the users or like the user developers, and kind of make it, for example, for Bitcoin developers, make them sort of consider less about all these concerns about the ZK, and just make it almost as if they're developing a simple script, and then that's it, because the computation, the apps are kind of not related actually to Bitcoin, although it serves Bitcoin, serves actually the Bitcoin holders to want to generate yield. I think that's something that we at zkVM is try to do, is to build the full experience. I mean, for gold, of course, but zkVM as well, to enable app development, easier, as everyone should do as a developer.
Yeah, awesome. Does anyone else have any more thoughts to add on?
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Morgan. All you.
Oh, sure. Thanks. So I think Ming is on point that the key technical challenge of Bitcoin scaling layers is the limited computational capacity of Bitcoin, which makes it very challenging to do something like verify a proof. Although it has been done on Bitcoin, it's very expensive. And for this reason, I'm bullish on the idea of optimistic fraud proofs as the most viable path forward for Bitcoin scaling layers. So BitLayer did this with Groth 16. I think a good next step could be to have like an optimistic Stark verifier. So Stark proofs would help. Stark proofs don't have a trusted setup process, and so verifying Stark proofs on chain would help with reducing the trust assumptions. And if you use optimistic zk fraud proof, then you get a lower amount of storage on chain and computing on chain required to verify the proofs. So that to me seems like something that would be helpful for making these Bitcoin scaling layers that I haven't seen out there yet, although maybe it's out there.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. And before we continue, I'm wondering if any, because I heard some feedback on my end. So while others are speaking, if we could all just mute while someone is speaking, that would be great. But definitely agree that, and definitely see some trends where like the key technical challenge is, as you said, Morgan, the limited computational capacity of Bitcoin. And really interesting that you mentioned that very much bullish on these optimistic fraud proofs for Bitcoin scaling. Would love to dive into that more later down in the conversation. But Ratan, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that they covered it. Yeah, I think one thing that I think is surfaced by everyone's points and probably deserves to be repeated again is no longer for applications that are deploying is zk the limitation, right? Like we have these like excellent teams that we work with that now get to spend their whole day just thinking about how can we make this work with Bitcoin, whereas before they were concerned about like, oh, like will we actually be able to build an application that works well on top of Bitcoin? Like we have a team, for example, that we work with called Alpin that's launching this project called Strata, which essentially allows you to deploy EVM compatible rollups on top of Bitcoin. And for them, right, like they get to design this beautiful, mechanism for ensuring that the validity of the rollups is correct on Bitcoin. And they don't have to worry at all about the component of actually launching, a zkVM on top of Bitcoin, right? And then you have other projects like Rift that can focus on building a great bridge interface, right, for users rather than spending, a long time trying to push for different opcodes to be added to Bitcoin in order to enable some application. I think Bitcoin in many ways is like incredibly ossified, right? So like, I think that requiring your application to depend on a new opcode being added to Bitcoin is a path towards sadness. So I'm glad that teams no longer have to be dependent on that. Now, of course, Opcat would be very nice, but there are many things that we can do before Opcat lands to actually bring zk to the Bitcoin ecosystem, which I think is beautiful.
Thank you, Ratan. Yeah, I definitely agree that we should build towards not having to wait for like potential implementations to be made, which may or may not happen. It would be great, as you said, if opcode were to be implemented, but we should really try to focus on building zk on Bitcoin, but without having to like fully depend on these kinds of implementations, whether or not they happen in the future. I wanted to also dive into more about the technical requirements for deploying zkVMs on Bitcoin. are there any sort of implementations that require any changes to, say, Bitcoin's consensus? Can it work with the current protocol? I'm also curious to hear if there are any specific architectural design considerations that must be made in order to extend or apply your respective zkVM to scaling Bitcoin. Are there any particular, for example, execution models or even proof systems that are better suited for Bitcoin specifically?
I think, sorry if I go first, like one limitation for Bitcoin, and like Morgan and everyone has talked about how limited execution is on Bitcoin, is that you're probably gonna have to use a Groth16 wrapper. I think even verifying a Groth16 wrapper on Bitcoin is a few $100s, which could be quite expensive. I think this does highlight another necessary piece of infrastructure, and I know some teams are already building on this, is you're going to need like one aggregator for Bitcoin. It's going to be very advantageous for all of these rollups and programmable layers on top to share that verification cost. The good thing is Bitcoin has 10-minute block times, and you're only going to post one every 10 minutes. So between like 10 to 20 rollups, you can really start to amortize the cost, which will be really nice. To my knowledge, there's no hard blocker for RISC-0, and I don't think there's going to be a hard blocker for the other teams. Someone's verified one of our proofs on Bitcoin already, and I don't think there will be any issues there.
Oh, hi, Ming. If you're currently speaking, I believe you're muted.
Oh, sorry about yeah. So yeah, I think I agree. There's no blocker on the not any unless there's a bug or something. But that aside, there's always bugs. That aside, I don't think there's any significant blockers on the zkVM side. On the Bitcoin side, yeah, I think opcat would be nice. I also know like there's opzkp, which is even nicer, which would be like a true. I think Eli mentioned something, or someone else, like a true roll-up, like a native roll-up. Oh, that's Justin. Anyway, but now I mean, like our team is similar to Citria, similar to I think RISC-0 for that matter, the BitVM 2 and BitVM in general, that approach, and I think for that there's that limitation of the the capacitive blockchain. It's a limited scripting capability. So that's why the BitVM2 is built, promoted in the first place. And then there's 10-minute interval. I think that's could be a good thing or bad thing, because you always have that 10-minute latency. And also there's the limit for 1 meg. There's I think Justin mentioned there's a holy war waged quite some ages ago for that. So there's those are the limits. So for that matter, Groth16. Well, we in the in the zkVM field, we have better protocols, but I think for now, Groth16 is stuck with we're stuck with that because of these limitations. But there's no hard technical barriers, as it's just the teams kind of ready for deployment of BitVM2, and because this is the most viable path anyway. Yeah. I'm done.
Okay, great. Yeah, it seems like based on what you, Jacob, and Ming were saying, that most of the limitations and barriers lie on the Bitcoin side rather than on the zkVM side. Like what you mentioned, Jacob, verifying the Groth16 wrapper is expensive. It would be ideally more advantageous to share those verification costs. And Ming, you talked a little bit about the limiting scripting capabilities. Ratan and Morgan, do you have any more thoughts to add?
I think you guys have about covered it. The situation isn't substantially different for Valida. If you have a proof, you can wrap it however you like. However, it's nice to be verified on Bitcoin. So, that's a hard problem.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to ask you all a bit more about some of the security considerations, trust assumptions as well. So what are the trust assumptions security models involved in your zkVM setups? Will these assumptions, models, or any kind of mechanisms that you use on the security side be affected when being extended to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think one point that Vitalik brought up pretty recently, which I think is going to likely be where a lot of work goes in the future, is that the Grod16 circuit-specific trusted setups are something that people would like to leave behind. Now, one thing that's interesting is, as Jacob mentioned, if you want to verify a proof on Bitcoin, well, you already, from my understanding, Bitcoin has split it across a bunch of transactions, right? Like you have to do this whole complex challenge mechanism. Plonk verification is more compute intensive than Grod16. So if you move to, or actually, let me describe at a high level what's going on. So Grod16 basically is circuit-specific trusted setup. Plonk circuits are universal trusted setup. What this means is for Plonk, a team called Aztec did a one-time generation of randomness for the circuits, and now everyone can reuse this randomness, right? So you have one person that does a universal trusted setup, and then all circuits in the future can use this. However, it's more expensive to verify those proofs. If we move to using Plonk proofs for, let's say, these aggregation proofs that are being posted to Bitcoin, the transactions would be more expensive. So I think one trade-off that I think is interesting here is that if you're going to move to an aggregation-based model and you want to remove the trust assumptions associated with circuit-specific trusted setups, you're going to pay more compute cost. And so this is something that teams will have to be mindful of. And I do think it'll probably be something where teams start with Grod16 and then move to Plonk as demand goes up. So, for right now, people care about that 3x overhead, so they use Grod16. But when enough transactions and proofs are being landed on this, are being put inside of this aggregation proof, people will be more comfortable using Plonk. And I think we're going to see the same thing on Ethereum too. So I think that's one kind of component about that. That's pretty much the only place where it interacts with Bitcoin. So I think that's the thing that people will care about.
Yeah, I think let me chip in. So I think the both of these scenarios might find it could be one way for Ethereum because Ethereum just want cheap computation, but Bitcoin necessarily because Bitcoin could have a really expensive transaction involved the value it carries. For example, a very expensive transaction involves a lot of money, right? And they could, there could be a case to adopt a more secure because more funds are are involved. They want to a more direct, secure, less trust up. So so we could opt for that in those scenarios. So both can be argued to have a place. And then for cheap transactions, there's a lot of aggregation. Then Grod16 probably is going to be maybe majority of the transactions. But for those who can afford it, there are a lot of people can afford it. For example, like an institutional transaction that involves a large amount of funds could adopt what was discussed by Vitalik, a general setup. It's what I think.
Yeah, thank you, Ming. Morgan or Jacob, any other thoughts to add?
I think the only additional surface area for attack that I can think of would just be the verifier implementation in BitVM or on like BitScript or whatever you choose to do the verifier in. Additionally, to Ratan's point, maybe there would be an interesting mid-step of, the Bitcoin community could, come together and do one giant Groth16 trusted setup ceremony, and then the input for that circuit be like a universal plonk that you could use for all the ecosystem projects.
Yeah, so I think the question was about like trust assumptions and zkVMs. And I think, the situation for Valida, which is also the situation for SP1 and for RISC-0, is that there are no trust assumptions in the zkVM proof protocol. And where the trust assumptions in this Bitcoin scaling scenario come in is in various proposed ways of doing the wrapper to put it onto the layer 1, the most prominent of which being Groth16. I do also want to flag their cryptographic assumptions, which are not trust assumptions that these protocols are making. Like we're assuming that P is not NP. I think probably the most questionable assumption we're making currently, and this is common to all 3 zkVMs I mentioned, is we're assuming that that a hash function can be sufficiently approximated by a random function for purposes of validating the soundness of the Fiat-Shamir heuristic application.
Absolutely. And yeah, it seems like over here, based on what was discussed, is a lot of it, trust assumptions may potentially come from the verifier implementation. And to your point, Ratan, I really liked how you mentioned the trade-off. If we were to use these aggregation-based models and remove certain trust assumptions, the cost will go up, but that's a trade-off to be considered. So really like that point that you made. And I also wanted to go into some more details into any particular types of use cases or applications that you're personally excited about, specifically new kinds of use cases that that zkVMs can be used to enable for Bitcoin. Are there any that you're particularly excited about or are currently working on to build?
Let me jump in first on behalf of Goat, because we already found a use case and even started a new project for it, which is Goat, is to generate yield for Bitcoin holders. And I think a lot of people want to build rollups on Bitcoin is to try to replicate DeFi on Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a store of value. There's a lot of people holding these assets. Well, just one asset is Bitcoin, which has a lot of value stored there. And those values are idle. So, and especially for Bitcoin holders, because the culture of Bitcoin is hold, and is holder. That's why they call holders. And this culture kind of is kind of very has like 2 side effects. Well, the major one being that well, it's actually 2 sides of one effect is hold, right? So one side is that if you hold, the Bitcoin value would rise, right? And also will not just for yourself and for the whole ecosystem. So that's the rationale behind hold. But another side of this is that you cannot benefit for any this Bitcoin price hike, right? Like when the news is Bitcoin have a big jump, you would be happy, but you won't get any from it, right? Because you have to hold. If you sell, you could lose your value, and it's difficult for you to jump back in, because that's normally the case for a lot of people. Because you're not sailor, you're not those people, right? So then there's the use case very suitable for this is for them to be able to generate yield, right? To be able to generate yield, you have to have smart contracts, and you have be able to do like simple DeFi, right? Not very complicated, but simple DeFi. And that's a use case on Bitcoin alone. It's probably worth billions of dollars, and that's the most reason to start gold and also build all this technology infrastructure to support this one use case. So so that's the rationale behind the use cases on our from our point of view.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this already, but I think the applications in Bitcoin kind of fall into like 3 or 4 categories. You have, bridges, which are quite exciting, right? People want these assets on ETH or in other places on Sol, wherever you want to say. I think there's rollups that people are building, mostly EVM compatible, though, you could build like an SVM rollup on top of Bitcoin if you really want to do that too. Maybe there's some cool unlocks there. I think that people are also trying to build more token standards, right? So this is what NewBit, among other people, are trying to do. I think there's another team called Charms, which is working on their own Bitcoin programmable or ordinal standard. And I think that those 3 combined really give you a lot of the same properties that you have on ETH, right? You have a proliferation of assets. You have the ability to move those assets anywhere you want. And you have programmability at the layer of the asset, which unlocks new applications. And so I think with the rollups especially, it's going to be quite interesting to see if you have the same dynamics of people, trying to allow for differentiation between them, right? You're going to have rollups that are hyper optimized for DeFi applications. Maybe you have different ones that are optimized for bridging into and out of different ecosystems. Perhaps you have the development of, a super chain like ecosystem on top of Bitcoin. So I think these are kinds of questions that, teams that we're talking to are trying to answer. And especially after the launch of Babylon, I think we've seen that there's a lot of demand for making Bitcoin useful. Lombard, which is like another team, recently launched like a liquid staking token on top of Babylon. I think that these things will only be accelerated more with Bitcoin, and the teams that are working there are really incredible. I think, on ETH, it can get tiring to see people launch the same rollups over and over. On Bitcoin, it's very fresh, right? You have these new designs that are uniquely unlocked by access to an asset which no one had before. And so I think, we're generally quite excited about the teams that we're working with. I'm sure, that everyone else here is too. There's just this beautiful renaissance happening in Bitcoin due to ZK. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we get all the programmability you see on ETH. On top of the Bitcoin community gets to skip a lot of the pain that the Ethereum community has gone through over the last 2 years, which is like launching different rollups. It used to be like how EVM equivalent is your rollup, but now really everyone's just going for straight EVM equivalents. One use case I'm quite excited about that I think will pop up on Bitcoin is you saw a lot of, the world's largest institutional asset managers in the world choose to support Bitcoin ETFs before. Some have started to explore ways to get additional yield on their Bitcoin through certain protocols. And I think you'll start to see with ZK, since we sort of have this property of boundless verifiable execution now, they'll start to bring additional asset classes that you could do more advanced yield calculations and then back it by settling to Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jacob. And also, Ming, sorry to mention this again, but it seems like there's a lot of feedback coming from your end. If you could please mute it when you're not speaking, that would be really great. Thank you so much. But yeah, it seems like that there's quite a lot of use cases that we can be very excited about, whether it be ways in generating more yield, or Ratan, you mentioned about building more rollups on Bitcoin. And Jacob, what you mentioned that like the Bitcoin community really gets to kind of skip the pain that the Ethereum community had to face, and we now are like more prepared to build these kinds of applications. It's all very exciting. And just as a kind of like a last question before we close up, I'm very curious to hear more about the roadmap that each of your projects is going towards for further enhancing the functionality of your zkVM in relation to Bitcoin scaling. So I know some of you guys mentioned about some of the other projects that you're currently working with, but very curious to hear about some specific items in the roadmap that our members in the audience can look forward to. So how do you plan to also keep in pace with Bitcoin's potential future upgrades or changes in protocol in addition to this?
All right, let me jump in first. I think you asked earlier about the consensus. I think I didn't answer that, so let me just use up a minute to. Yeah, so the idea of bridging into Bitcoin is to minimize the consensus assumptions. But for that matter, we at the zkVM developed something called entangle rollup, which is kind of in the same spirit of like Superchain and these projects developed in other places. So in order to do that, that you have to keep your sort of in the same spirit of like functional program. You have to keep your computation pure, pure. Which is to establish these asset managers called like liquidity managers on the Bitcoin side. So this is something like maybe we can expand in other like discussions. Okay, so that's for the consensus side. Keep the computation pure. We have a special like treatment for oracles is that we arrange these oracles to be liquidity managers. So that's why we only do yield for as a base application layer. So all the various of applications could be a kind of yield paradigm. So you design in the gold ecosystem, all these applications could be fit into this category, fit this in paradigm. There's some kind of yield, and then we'll utilize a yield liquidity manager, and that minimize the security assumptions, make the computation pure. So so this also enables Go to build an ecosystem to provide yield and easy for applicant developers to follow the development paradigm, and also kind of minimize their exposure to security risks that may introduced by the computation, because we kind of enabled a complicated, very complex computing capability, and a settlement. For example, the challenge mechanism of BitVM is like we discussed by various guests of this conference, is kind of expensive. So, and bugs can also render the situation even more chaotic. So we develop this ecosystem, this paradigm, to make the development of all kinds of apps easier on the Go ecosystem. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ming. Anyone else would like to share any kinds of developments later down in the roadmap, or anything that you're particularly looking most forward to?
So at Lita, we're working on a Groth16 wrapper integration for valid execution proofs, and we're working on recursive proving, proof aggregation, as well as just like continuations, being able to prove arbitrarily long executions as a series of segments. So all of those should be coming out probably in the next few months. And at that point, it would be probably pretty viable to build rollups using Valida.
Yeah, I think one thing that we notice on Bitcoin is that, it's all Bitcoin transactions, right, are signed with SecP256K1 signatures, right? So this is like a elliptic curve that essentially is used for both signing like Ethereum and Bitcoin transactions. And so one thing that we have at SP1 and also RISC recently added support for is acceleration for K256 operations. We find that for teams that are trying to do things like zero sync, proving the state of Bitcoin from Genesis, this kind of acceleration is critical. And it's actually quite paramount that your zkVM supports great performance on that, not only in benchmarks, but actually practically. And I think that this is where it's been really nice to see that this burden of proving out the utility of your zkVM is no longer handled by the zkVM team itself, but rather by the teams that are just building on top of it and seeing the utility of it. I think similarly to what we talked about earlier, where we were talking about what are the security assumptions for deploying an application using zkVMs on Bitcoin, and we were talking about, do you want to use Plonk or Rot16? I think for Bitcoin applications that depend on ZK critically, it's important that you have a censorship resistant and cheap way to get your proofs. I think that at Succinct, we're really trying to make this viable with the Succinct network. It's important that you don't just depend on one party, but rather a number of them to get applications that are requiring proofs on a critical path to actually use a system that they can depend on in production. So it's something that we're excited about. I think it'll be used all across Bitcoin, both for the rollups and for the bridges. And yeah, excited to see what happens moving forward.
Yeah, I'll just add on to Ratan because we seem to be working on similar things here. I think an additional precompile also is going to be not only do you want these like curves, but you also want certain hash functions, and Blake 3 is like quite prevalent in the Bitcoin ecosystem. At RISC, I mean, just like the people at Lita and Succinct, we're just trying to make ZK as cheap and fast as possible, right? We want as much compute at an affordable and practical pace as well. One contribution we're going to do for the whole space this year is we've partnered with the folks at Irreducible, and we're going to go ahead and implement the first RISC-V zkVM with Binius as the backend. Early numbers here show that it could be a magnitude speed up, and it's really good. Just like in general, hash-based proving is really good on accelerated hardware. So also very excited to work with them with that. We chatted earlier about how zkVMs have sort of fixed the development side, but with Boundless, we're really focused on fixing the deployment side. So how can we bring production-ready ZK infrastructure that gives you really strong liveness guarantees with the best market price for your proving possible, and make sure you don't have to leave where you are? That's where we're all focused on Boundless right now. It's currently in testnet. You can go develop. We'll be moving into the next phases very soon, and then hopefully mainnet this year.
Seems like from everyone, there's many new exciting developments to keep in mind for. But thank you everyone for joining the discussion. It seems like all of the zkVMs here are really trying to optimize for that developer experience. We no longer need to hire a huge team of cryptographers, but now we can extend these ZK capabilities to regular everyday developers. It seems like many of our current limitations for scaling aren't really from the zkVM side, but from the Bitcoin side, like how you all mentioned that it could be very expensive, especially, for example, verifying a Rot16 wrapper. There's some trade-offs to consider with trust assumptions, but with zkVMs, by enabling a proof of arbitrary compute for any type of program, it can really help power the next stage for Bitcoin. And now we're able to see and build new use cases and applications that we haven't even thought were possible before. So we're definitely in a very exciting time. And I appreciate all of you for all of your insights.
Thank you, Alice and panelists, for a great conversation.